So this video is going to cover our economic changes of the Industrial Revolution and how the economy kind of evolved during this time period. If you remember back to the beginning of the unit, economic means dealing with the exchange of goods and services and money. So this is all going to focus around like corporations and money and taxes. So vocab, Industrial Revolution, we've already kind of gone over that period where people begin to use complex machines. Capital, money, we went over that in the beginning of the unit also. If you have capital, you have a bunch of money. Enterprise is just a business you have began. And entrepreneur is a person who begins a business. These should all be reviewed from the 4.1 note. So the Industrial Revolution, we've already gone over, begins in the 17 to 1800s, early 1900s, and it starts in Great Britain, and it spreads very, very gradually. The keys to it are first the textile industry. So machines like the spinning jenny, the flying shuttle, and the power loom make it more efficient to make clothes, makes that at a big industry. They kind of combine the steam engine with the modern factory system to give birth to this idea of using machines to complete all the work. Then you have steam power added in. You have oil production eventually becomes very important, iron and steel production, and the cities. So all these come together to make the Industrial Revolution very possible. So our first kind of step in this is the Agricultural Revolution, which we went over, but we're going to go over it in a little more detail. So the Agricultural Revolution features increased food production where you can feed more people. Per farmer. So there's new methods of cultivation to grow on unused land and use land that hadn't been previously used in farming before. Selective breeding also makes it so livestock are bigger and fatter and are producing more milk and more meat per animal. So you just have more food available, which what we went over causes the population to explode. The enclosing movement, another thing we already went over, but we're reviewing more in depth, is where peasants used to share land collectively. And this isn't very efficient because nobody knows whose land is whose, and everybody is running their own little individual plots. So the wealthy begin to buy up land, so they would buy up like all this and work it as one farm. And these large farms are a lot more efficient and productive because those wealthy landowners can afford machines where one farmer could do the work of 20. And then those out of work farmers go to the cities to find jobs in the factories. The major results of the agricultural revolution just being the unemployed farmers move to the cities because they have to find work and the farms are working more efficiently and do not need all those farmers. Improved farming and machines make more and cheaper food, so people don't all have to farm. Even if a person didn't want to farm and wanted to open some kind of other enterprise, they could because the farmers were making so much food that they could just buy their food. And the most important thing, the population explosion. Population absolutely just goes through the roof, and that causes a lot more people to work in the factories and urbanize. The next step, we're going to go a little more in depth into the energy revolution. And the energy revolution was where man began to look at different ways of getting work done and using different energy sources to do that work. And coal is going to be the first thing that is really used to power these different machines. Coal leads to the steam engine and it replaces the muscle power of the horses and people who got a lot of the work done. Coal could be used to create the better and steel and iron, which is then easier to produce. It's less expensive to produce, which means you can build more bridges, more buildings more cheaply. And that also is a key part of these cities expanding. The Bessemer process is what does this. The Bessemer process is invented and makes steel extremely cheap. And steel is still the foundation of modern society. With cheap steel, you can build bigger bridges, you can build bigger ships, you can build bigger buildings, and it's the backbone of the industrial society. Finally, we have the rise of the factory. So we have this increase in labor from the agricultural revolution. Now we have a new energy source from coal, and we combine that together with the factory system. So the cottage industry, which we already went over again, is where merchants distribute their raw materials to families, and then the families process it, and the artisans create that final product. This is a very inefficient system because it is spread out amongst different families who then have to ship it back to the manufacturer. And it's very, very, very slow. The factory system is a lot more effective. This is where you bring workers, materials, and machines all under one roof, and you allow a product to be made in one area. It's a lot more effective, it's a lot faster, and this creates cheaper products which people can then buy. The effects of the factory system are, first and foremost, goods are easy to produce. They become cheaper. Wage labor becomes a thing. People are paid per hour or based on how much they make of a product. And this also attributes to urbanization because you place factories in the cities and people move there for those jobs. So you can see the factory system here. Companies increase their production of a good, which causes new machines and innovations to be made to keep up with that production, which makes it easier to produce those goods. So you have more goods, which causes the prices of those goods to fall, which makes more people want those goods, which makes companies increase that production again, which leads to more and better machines. And the cycle begins over and over and over. And we can see this whenever a new product is made. Like originally, cell phones cost thousands of dollars, but now you can honestly get a cell phone at Walmart and take it out of the plastic for not that expensive if you don't want anything too fancy. As a product gets more popular, the companies want to produce more of it, which makes the price of it fall, which makes them have to come up with innovations to keep their prices low. And this is kind of the snowball effect of the Industrial Revolution right here that allows more and more people to have access to more and more goods. Now, one of the new things I'm going to introduce with these notes is the corporation. And corporations are a direct product of the expensive new industries from the Industrial Revolution. So the new industries like coal, steel, iron production, oil, shipbuilding during the Industrial Revolution are crazy expensive. So the solution is the corporation and selling stock. So stock is shares of a company that are sold off, and it allows people to invest little by little in that company and not risk as much money if the company doesn't perform well. So it's owned by a lot of different people. A corporation is essentially group ownership of a company. And a corporation is also treated as an individual. So if a person loses money in their corporation, they don't lose it from their personal fortune, they lose it from their corporation. So it's safer to try these industries that are very, very expensive and try to make money in them because you won't lose your personal fortune. There were two types of the major corporate entities, and they were the captains of industry and the robber barons. And the captains of industry are people who use their giant corporations for good. They created jobs with their new oil production and steel and iron. They invested their wealth into, public parks and libraries and schools, and they did provide valuable products and services that the public needed. The other side is the robber barons, and these are the bad. They're the people who exploit their workers. They pay them bottom dollar, don't let them form a union, to put them out of business. They corrupt government officials to try and get their way, and they create monopolies and cartels to kind of control the economy. Corporations started to form what's called the monopolies and the cartels, and this kind of goes along with the whole idea of robber barons. And a monopoly is just like it is in the board game, and it's where you control an entire industry. So a corporation is the only person who makes toilet paper or oil, and it lets them control the price, because if there's only one place to get oil from, that person 100% controls the price. This can really hurt consumers because consumers then have to pay the price that that company demands. A cartel, on the other hand, is where several companies, so two or more, work together to control and fix prices. They set quotas on production, so there will only be so much of a good produced so that it will drive the price up. And this is also hurtful to consumers because it can artificially inflate the price. So monopoly example would be Standard Oil. At one point, Rockefeller Standard Oil controlled most of the world's oil and all of the oil in the United States. And cartels would be, there was a company called the Northern Securities Railroad Company where they all agreed to only run so many trains so that they could inflate the price of the tickets. Now, in response to the rise of these absolutely huge corporations, organized labor begins to be kind of the worker's voice during this time period of the Industrial Revolution. So, factory work, as we've gone over, was extremely dangerous, and it was 12 16-hour workdays, 6 days a week, low pay. There were lots of problems with the factories back then, and workers didn't just want to live their whole life like this, they wanted to improve their um, position. And also, the corporations were making billions and billions of dollars in profits, and they felt like they should have a share of this. So the solution at first was the Mutual Aid Society. And the Mutual Aid Society is kind of treating the symptoms of the issues of the Industrial Revolution, where everybody would pay into like a common fund, and if somebody was hurt on the job, they could withdraw money from that fund until they could get back to work. It doesn't address the problems of the low pay or the dangerous working conditions, but it makes it so someone doesn't totally lose their home or their kids don't starve just because they are out of work for a little bit. Socialism also became a very, very big draw during this time because socialists wanted to get rid of a lot of the capitalist issues during the Industrial Revolution. So these two ideas grow very, very quickly. But the idea that's going to address most of the issues is going to be the labor union. So the labor union came about because of universal male suffrage. When all men got the right to vote, they began to demand that their workplaces become more fair and safer to them. And labor unions are always going to do one of three or all three of these things. They're going to demand for better wages, better hours, and better conditions. So they're going to want raises for their workers. They're going to want safety equipment to keep people from getting hurt on the job, or they're going to want to lessen the hours that are required to be worked. To do this, they use strikes. They stop work at a factory, because if they stop work at a factory, the factory owner loses money and the factory owner will then give in to their demands. It's not that easy, though, and there are quite literally shootouts in front of factories over workers trying to get better working conditions and better pay over time. Eventually, though, they would begin to win the reforms that they demand. Some of the reforms would be child labor laws to get children out of the workplace. There would be a limit of an 8-hour workday in most countries. There'd be a minimum wage established, and there'd be pensions and unemployment for if somebody was hurt on the job and it wasn't their fault, they would get a pension from the company. You can see the 8-hour workday here. It's kind of based on that you split your day into thirds. You have 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, and then 8 hours for just kind of doing what you want and hanging out. The unions are still very strong in many countries, especially in Europe. In the United States, there's very, very powerful unions that fight for better conditions and better pay for their workers. And that's kind of one of the main legacies from the Industrial Revolution. So hopefully that adds a little more context to the Industrial Revolution, the economic changes. If you need any help, just let me know. And if you missed the previous lecture, it's up here in the right-hand corner, and our next lecture will be down here in the left.